But yeah, now to the workshop part of the workshop. Um, where do we go from here in terms of woody encroachments in southern African mountains? We've heard that we have some policy, or not policy, but legislative aspects for aliens. We have a pre-policy for a woody encroachment with some legislative stuff under CARA. We have the Mountain Areas Catchment Act, which is underutilized but could be a mechanism for a legal framework. We have a lot of really fantastic experts in the house and online, and we've had some science. So where do we go with woody encroachments in southern African mountains? What should we be doing next? And can we drive it from a science and a policy and a practitioner sort of pronged approach simultaneously, or do we need one before the other? So really, we're gonna open it up now to an interactive discussion. There's no right or wrong comments. Um, maybe just some primers, or do we know enough to actually have a comprehensive policy in terms of mountains itself? Or is our knowledge bias still in the savanna zone with bush encroachments? Is there particular knowledge we need to understand things better? Um, maybe the practitioners who are here, I think our one practitioner left. There might be others. I know in the Eastern Cape Mountains there are practitioners doing macro scale control of things like leucocidia. So where to now? So we're going to open it up. Just also to discuss for questions. It's very much a fruit salad now. So and then we'll just guide it in a direction from there. So.
I sort of with a very practical question, and that is what is it about them that there are no registered herbicides? Because I mean, the herbicide companies would jump on it because it's a mega economic opportunity. But what is it about these rosaceae or something that doesn't let them get killed by herbicide?
Sorry, not completely answer it, but Graham Harding told me that herbicide companies are not really interested in developing herbicides for uh, small problems. In that the herbicides that they develop are for weeds in agricultural systems where they're treating millions of hectares. So to develop a new herbicide costs a lot of money. And if it's for an area where there's not a lot of budget, they're reluctant to do it, unfortunately.
So just to continue that, within invasive alien plants in South Africa, I might be wrong, but I only know of one project currently, and that's for pines, and that's Graham Harding's been running it, and that's been not funded by herbicide company, though it's funded by DFFE. And so they've had to put the money forward, Cape Nature's put the resources forward, and it's by itself they've been doing it for 10 years, I think, already. And so that's the one example I know of. So there's so many that should still be done.
Thanks. Just to follow that, as I understand it, I mean, you said you were trying, so you could use something like picloram or garlon or something. It doesn't need the development of a new herbicide. It just needs to be registered for its use. I don't know, but maybe they don't die from it. Maybe you can't wipe them out.
So again, I might get this wrong. That's what we did. So we sort of, as a private landowner, I said, well, the chemical company said I could do it. But unless it's registered, it's illegal. So it has to be registered for that species. And on the pamphlet, it'll say what species. And if you don't, it was the oddest conversation. And I had to beg for apologies and all the rest. And Yeah, so I'm still ignorant of it. I emailed to ask for clarity, and it wasn't a clear response. But I think somebody in the room was mentioning that, and I've seen it in the Eastern Cape, guys spraying broad-leafed herbicides from helicopters and planes and things. So I assume you might be able to follow the right protocols to get permission, but I haven't seen it.
You bought your own mic.
Thanks. So forgive my ignorance. I don't know all the ways in which the veg and the biome maps are used, but just listening to Brian's talk, I didn't realize that in legislation people would refer to the biomes when making specific decisions, if that actually gets used. I was just wondering, do we know what they use when making those decisions? Are they sourcing it from the vegetation map, or like how much does our map matter and how much should we be stressing about its influence on these decisions?
Sorry, what decisions? Could you just repeat the?
On one of your slides, it was that for one of the species per biome, there were different decisions in the fynbos and in the thicket, and then different decisions again in the karoo types. And so do they use some sort of map, or do they go on the ground and make decisions based on what biome they've seen? What do they use to decipher where the biomes are?
Okay, the thing is that some species are invasive in particular biomes and not in others. And that is known by advice, basically, from ecologists. So when they drew up the lists, there were, as a gentleman from DFFE said, there were workshops, and there was input from different sectors. So there's no formal method. It's just basically expert opinion that resulted in those kind of, pines are invasive in the fynbos, but not in the karoo, for example. And if that answers your question, then.
Kind of, thank you. It's more about whether they use the maps when they make decisions. That was.
No, they didn't use a map.
Yeah.
They use expert knowledge.
Okay. Thanks.
Maybe I'll comment there. The Veg Map project of South Africa defines the biomes and where they are spatially. And I can't remember your name now. Anisha is part of that Veg Map program. So she's interested to know the impact of the Veg Map mapping actually affects the invasive species legislation, because what they map means it determines whether something is invasive or not in a particular area, depending on what that biome is that they've mapped.
Well, I guess if it went to if it came to going to court, for example, and somebody's property was in a particular biome that's mapped as that, then you could go to the legislation and say, well, it's exempted in the thicket biome, and my farm is in the thicket biome, therefore I'm okay. But that wasn't used in the decision to formulate the law, but it might be tested in court, and then they would need a map. Yes. Just to make you feel that you're doing something useful.
It's one of those scenarios where, and not even on the risk assessments, if the data is available, it will be used. So I know Shyness terebinthifolia was exempt. It was only in the tropical parts of South Africa. However, then somebody did some modeling that said, look, it's going to become really invasive in the Western Cape, and therefore they added it. So it's like, I think Brian talks about these groups. If they're sitting there and there's no data, they'll say, well, to best of our knowledge, it's not invasive in the Karoo. But then if some data comes up, then it can change.
Yes. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to make a comment on that issue of herbicides, registered herbicides for rosaceae. I just wanted to mention that, there is what you call a research permit to use certain herbicides, as long as that herbicide, is acceptable and registered in South Africa, for something else, but not for the species you want to use it for. So you can apply for that research permit. I think it sits with the agriculture, the registrar of Act 37. So 36, yes. Yeah, it sits there. So one could get that permission, in this case. Because yes, we also work with species that are limited in distribution at Sanbi. And I know the pain of, herbicide companies not being interested to test certain herbicide because they're not going to make profit from it. Yeah. I guess it would depend, because the one I'm talking about is a research permit where maybe you will explain what you're planning to do, what you want to get out of it. And then it's got a short time period, of course. So I guess you will need to apply and apply again. So we'll just have to check the protocols that they set out for that research permit.
I'm just keeping the online folk in mind as well. Anything online?
Yes, Earl had a question, but I think your answer answered him, so I'm just waiting for him to reply. Okay, here we go. Can we get input from someone in the legal fraternity about the use of herbicides which are not registered for a specific plant? The advice we received is that herbicide companies are required to say which plant their product is registered for, but there is no legal requirement for landowner to only use a herbicide that is registered for a particular plant. So if Garlon is found to work on a species, it could be used by a landowner even if it is not listed on the product info sheet. Obviously, it is better to use a registered herbicide, but chemical companies are under no obligation to test their products on every plant, so we'll never have a situation where all plants have registered herbicides. Thanks. Earl.
I will take that under advice, but at the moment, I'm not 100% sure that is accurate.
All right. Any other questions or comments on anything, but especially herbicides? Because Grant can't do anything on his farm, so we've solved this problem.
I'm just interested in any comments on having listened to Brian's talk about legislation and what's required of people in terms of, or not necessarily people, but sand parks or whatever, in terms of removing aliens, and what people's opinions are with respect to cases like, there were lots of people wrote popular articles about how the aliens influenced the UCT fires, for example. And I don't know, I just feel like there's not lots of, sorry? UCT fires, for example. So lots of people wrote popular articles about, how that influenced spotting or anything like that. And I don't know if anyone's got strong opinions whether certain entities should be doing more about the aliens, because, that's an example where something bad can happen. I don't know if it's practical. That's my point. That's that's why I'm asking the question. And I think William also wrote an article. I'm not sure. Just wanted to open up the discussion, if there is any.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It was in 1985, I published a paper on, because people had said, were saying things like aliens increase the fire danger. So we looked at three species. We looked at fynbos, and we looked at Acacia saligna, and we looked at Hackia sericea. And we chopped them up and we measured them and we looked at their moisture content and we put it all into a fire behavior model, and we chose different weather conditions and we ran the model. You're familiar with all of this stuff, right? And it came out that the vegetation type that burnt with the highest intensity was fynbos. And now this paper has been highly cited. And people will write something in their papers like, alien species are known to increase fire intensity, in brackets, Van Wilgen and Richardson, 1985. They didn't read the paper. They just read the title and said, oh, well, there's something I can cite, And that's it. And then for 25 years, nobody looked at it again. And then more recently, Dave Scott, he looked at the impact of fire intensity where aliens were on soil damage and soil erosion and soil water repellency. And he found that where aliens were present on a site, there was more soil water repellency and erosion than on sites that were in fynbos. So that was a bit of ammo. And then Tineke Kraai published a paper on the fires in Knysna, where she looked at remote sensing, and she used that to map where the vegetation before the fire was either plantations or aliens or natural vegetation. And she found that more biomass was consumed where there were aliens and plantations than where there was natural vegetation. So I don't think she did anything about spotting. But the argument was that because more biomass was being consumed, the intensity must have been higher, because it's a factor that goes into. And then more recently, Tineke also published a paper now on the flammability of different species. So she looked at which ones are more likely to catch fire. And it was a mixture. Some of them were aliens and some of them were indigenous. So that's the total science behind everything. And there's all this stuff been flung around about the UCT fire and many other fires, which people are just looking for someone to blame. There's a huge lot of money at stake here, 700 million rand, I think, and the insurance companies are trying to find someone who can give them ammunition.
Oh, there's 4 people online. There's a more recent paper by Kiros or something on the and with linking to the guy who heads up that fire engineering group at Stellenbosch, and that's focusing specifically on the damage to the town rather than the vegetation around it. And it's quite different. It's a different story, and it's very heavily ember driven. So embers flew right over an indigenous forest patch, about 2 kilometers wide, and burnt the houses the other side. The impact of new housing estates didn't burn at all, and because there was no vegetation around their houses. The older houses on top of hillsides were burnt out completely. So what it comes out to is that there's a massive impact of the homeowner himself, and what they're doing around their homes and what the landscaping is in their gardens. And there are trees that block embers, and there's some indication this is, I mean, there's far better work done in California and Australia, but this new paper is aware of that work and does cite it. So if you have rows of evergreen trees, they don't burst into flames. They will act as an ember block quite effectively, and that seemed to happen in some of the Niger fires. We know almost nothing about the sources of embers in South Africa. So which alien invaders actually provide embers? In Australia, the record is 45 kilometers, where firebrands blew up in the atmosphere in little burning pieces of rolled up bark and eucalypts floating along and then coming and landing, So a fire can start in Stellenbosch and hit Cape Town, just floating in the air. So this is the terrifying future of the world that ignores eucalypts as invaders. We're going to turn into Australia. Can anyone think of a more frightening, blooming scenario? So, so I think the fire side of the things and what happens on the urban edge is enormously important. It will become more so. It's been remarkable, the fires we've had. This Lehana fire in Hawaii, the worst fire in North American history, where 100 people died, 1,000 homes destroyed, and it was a grass fire that burnt, and it was about a kilometer or two wide, and the fire just roared through there and burnt down this home. So I think understanding fires better, it's not stopping fires in the veld. That helps to reduce the risk, but a better understanding of and especially the influence of invasives potentially around the edge, both to block the situation or to promote it. But I'm afraid that the knowledge at the moment is, I think, super thin. Yeah, and all of the work we've done was on the veld fires, and it's bloody good work. But when a fire changes and moves into cities, it's a different beast. It's very surprising. I was just wondering about, sorry, the hydrology side of things, which Michelle Tosha talked about. Do we have a good sense in our mountains of what the repercussions would be for downstream water users? Like with Dave LeMaitre, he was able to say that there'd be a 30% reduction, I think, in the water available to Cape Town. Do we have that for the grassland fires and for these magnificent mountains we've been seeing? Clearly, we need to put some sort of numbers on this stuff and wave banners about the costs before you're going to get a lot of work going on how to control them.
Brian can answer that, I think. I just want to add something to that. We in biocontrol always used to get our funding from Working for Water. And so we relied heavily on these papers from Dave LeMaitre on water use, all the rest. But the budget from government has gone more this last funding cycle to fire. And so I think we need to get some big papers out on the impacts of fires, not because of the ecological impacts, because that's where the money is going. So if we want funding to work on bush encroaching species, alien species, it's got to be based on what it's seeming like. More folks, we need some LeMaitre papers on these massive impacts of the fires to look for funding for managing invasive species, where in the past we always used water as our sort of our bone to government.
Yeah, I'll answer the question now about the water yield, but just an observation. The foresters knew about this years ago. If you look at a pine plantation, you often see 2 rows of eucalypts and they were planted as fire breaks. They were planted because nothing grows under a eucalypt, so there was less fuel, and they called them spark arresters way back then. So anyway, we could talk about this for hours. But on the water yield thing, David Lemaitre and a few others, they did a report which I don't think is very well known. It's a Water Research Commission report, and the question was, there's been demonstrated that invasions will reduce the amount of stream flow that comes out of a catchment area. But the question is whether the dam will run dry. And so the dam gets water in, and people draw water out, and the engineers design it for a 50 or 100-year failure based on historic data. And so what happens mainly, which happened in Cape Town, the Theewaterskloof Dam went down from 100% to 90, 80, 70, 60, 50. What did it go to 12 or something? And then it rained again, and it filled up, so it didn't fail. So the question was, if the catchment becomes completely invaded, will it fail more often? And the short answer is yes, it will. The risk of the whole water supply scheme failing increases quite a bit. So it won't happen very often, but we're going to get one of these days a real day zero where the city runs out, whether it's Cape Town or Port Elizabeth or George or whatever. One of them is going to run out. It's a very interesting piece of work that never got published in the peer-reviewed literature. Have you seen it? It's a Water Research Commission report. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm just wondering how many people have read South Africa's action plan on land degradation and neutrality for 2030. One of the goals is to clear 1 point whatever million hectares of invasive species and clear 6,333,702 hectares of bush encroachment. And it's got rehabilitation and sustainably manage, and it's got hectares for forest in Deeltekens, fynbos thicket, grassland, savanna, succulent karoo, namak karoo, desert. We've just been asked to appoint somebody on a committee to review these targets in light of COVID, so it's obvious they don't think they're going to meet these targets. But we've got somebody who's going to sit on this committee to review the targets who could potentially influence this. But I don't know how these are being operationalized. But this is an action plan coming from DFFE. And they're about to review these targets. So what would be really great is if we could almost synthesize some of the key points by the end of today coming out of this. And I can take that to Ryan, and when he's sitting on the committee, he can make sure that none of the critical points get lost and that we don't land up planting trees. I mean, the other day I got wind of an agenda item on Working Group 1 that was an action plan for the Great Green Wall in South Africa. So a couple of very rapid phone calls were made, and suddenly it was off the agenda. So there seem to be two factions fighting within DFFE almost around taking a science-based approach and something else that's looking after big pots of money. But the legislations that can assist us is the Water Act and this action plan. So if we want to give effect to it, we need to engage with the action plan. And if you've got any 1 million and just over 1 million by 2030. But that's one of the questions I also wanted to ask. Does anybody know? And at the same time, we've got the 30-30 target we have to meet. And one of the So one of the principles, so all of these things need to kind of come together. And one of the principles is in this is also to minimize degradation. I think I got that in there actually. Where we've got intact systems is to minimize them, and invasives are embedded in that.
Just read where it's from again.
Oh, it's DFFE. It's got a rubbish land degradation index map. Probably, I don't know where that came from. Second National Action Plan, Action Program for South Africa to combat desertification, land degradation, and the effects of drought. Because this is what they do at UNCCD. It's all linked to the UNCCD very weird negotiating scheme, which I've had the horrible experience of experiencing.
Ralph, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I suppose my first thought was, how bound are we to that? Is that official policy? Are we a signatory to that convention?
Then IPPC or IPBES.
Okay.
From a DFFE perspective, I might be wrong, but that's just my perspective. They take a massive delegation to this.
Okay.
And there was a big drive to develop a funding instrument where essentially rich countries must give poor countries money if they go into drought. And I said, that's silly, rather use the term extreme events. And
Yeah.
they ignored me, and all the countries asking for this are now sitting with landslides and floods. So anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, just one follow-up question. So I've never seen the document before, so ignorance. Do they mention? I mean, they have those figures. Do they say how it needs to be cleared? And is bush encroachment mentioned again in the document, or do they provide more information just that you could base it on? Because just a figure means very little.
So here's the data from Working for Water. Over 25 years, they have conducted control operations on 76,000 sites, which covered 2.7 million hectares. But now that the sites that they record are not all fully invaded, or they only clear on part of that site, or they only clear one species on the site and not. Yeah. The point is we don't know, because the information is not. It would never. Okay. And then the other thing about that 2.7 million hectares, it's about 14% of the estimated invaded area. So if they were to do this, they would have to put a lot of money into it.
So for those online, under the activities, it says strengthening communities' ability to adapt to the effects of desertification, blah, blah, blah. Map, monitor, and where practical and desirable, control bush encroachment and alien invasive species. Restore, rehabilitate, and conserve degraded ecosystems. Involve women and youth communities and other agencies in the restoration, rehabilitation, and conservation of degraded ecosystems. That's the...
I think we need some guidance from you guys on. There's an international interest in mountains, and to what extent is that curiosity driven? And if so, let's talk about curiosity. To what extent is it driven by concerns about the future of mountains? And if you give us an international perspective on the future of mountains, that is also something that we can use to boost action and policy I need to get the jargon right. Policy in practice.
I've just asked Clive to stick some very sketchy stuff I've drawn. I think on what you're saying to put up there. But just start your question again because I missed the first bit.
What is the international concern? Which is largely, you want to find out more about mountains?
Yeah, it's a good question because I think we've had to do a little bit of brainwashing in that consortium as well about what our systems are like. Like we chatted about at dinner last night, our mountain systems are very different to most other mountain systems in the world. Maybe Australia's are most similar to ours in terms of being old paleo-erosion land surfaces post-Gondwana with majority of grassland, less tree diversity, more forb and graminoid diversity, which is very different, obviously, to the Alps and other northern hemisphere mountains, and also, even some of the South American systems are more woody than ours. So the Range X as a consortium certainly has an interest in non-native species and what they're doing in mountains. So there's a conservation or a management focus there, science to management. But this particular project is any range expanding species, which is why we've included indigenous and non-natives in that. From a South African point of view, Range X really, and the ARU in general, as well as collaborators like CBC, Centre for Biological Control, and others, SAON, etc. So I'm taking liberty of speaking on part of the community here. I think a session like this really helps us to pull mountains out as a separate focus from general national invasive species and bush encroachment topics. So generally, at a national level, mountains are not really seen as something distinct in the legislation or in the practice of management. So we really just want to lift that out because mountains are topographically much more complex, and they're more difficult to manage problems in. Like Grant said earlier, if you have rosaceae, pyracantha growing in a cliff in Golden Gate, it's a lot more difficult for sandparks to deal with that pyracantha than to deal with it growing next to the road outside Clarence, for instance. So the high elevation clearing team and the Working for Water program is a good example of how that's been done in the Cape region. But again, mountains, because they're so big, and Kim's talk really spoke to that as well. Mountains are extensive across South Africa, but there's limited data to decide on priorities. So the Maluti-Drakensberg doesn't have a high elevation team to deal with the rapid expansion of rosaceae species, and we're probably going to have Leucocidia growing on top of the berg in the next maybe 20 to 50 years. The highest I've seen is 2,800 meters at the Sentinel on the Zigzag Trail. That's not very far from there to the top through natural dispersal by wind. So we're probably looking at a rapid change in the system in the Maluti-Drakensberg in the next 20. Am I being apocalyptically under cautious, or would you say that Maluti-Drakensberg risks becoming a woody system in the next 20 to 50 years? Based on what I've seen at Tishlanyani National Park, where Leucocidia is wall to wall, up to 2,800 meters, I would say yes.
If you look at Catchment 9, I know it's going to come on. With Catchment 9, it's taken, that catchment was the fire suppression started in about 1945, I think,
Okay.
and it's taken a long time to. Is that right?
I'm surprised it's taken that long.
It took it well. It's also flippin' difficult to keep fire out of that system. So a lot of it will depend on the physiology of what happens with the water balance and how different C3, C4 things respond, I suppose. But yeah, I would say not in 20 years, but it's invasives. If invasives get in, it might be a different story.
But if we take carbon compounding like William showed, we've added, what, 20 billion tons in a year? Would that, if we add carbon compounding, we add warming compounding, we add potential fire compounding, or that could set things back, I don't know.
If
Bird
you want me
compounding.
to be very honest around the carbon story, the biggest threat and the easiest threat to manage right now is breaking ground in the lower slopes. So anything that's outside of conservation areas that where we don't have broken ground, that needs to be prioritized immediately in the 30-30 strategy.
Yeah.
And they are trying to do that, and I think they are focusing on strategic water source areas. It's almost like we need to create a buffer around the mountain to stop the spread of the invasives. What our woodies do, I think they'll probably go a bit slower.
The thing is, if that bird dispersed, then it doesn't stop them.
Man, I read an interesting paper in preparation for this lot from South America, where they're worrying about the cloud forests, which are being nibbled at from below. But they talk about the grass line, and the cloud forests are not moving into the grass line.
Yeah.
So they're being squeezed.
Okay.
So this is really quite extraordinary. So the leucocidia is an interesting example, and I think so are the proteas. But maybe we got the cloud forest thing. Maybe it's the forest versus savanna, but those forests are not moving, and they're very worried about them disappearing.
Yeah.
And nobody knows why there is that grass line stopping the forest from moving. I know there is some work from Monica Buerta, I think, and Sally Archibald, and there's only just a single paper on what keeps forests out of the grasslands. But it might be slower than we think, for reasons that nobody has researched as yet. So it's a very interesting area to get into and say, hey, we have the answers. You know, pass our airfare and we'll come and tell you what's going on in your cloud forests in the Andes.
Yeah. Clive, I don't know, is it possible to put the whole page on the screen? Oh, there we go. Okay, great, thanks. There was another question.
So just something to add what Sue said about the fire exclusion. So Giant's Castle has a 200-hectare fire exclusion zone, and it hasn't been burned for between 60 and 70 years. And a fire went through it, and the majority of the fire exclusion zone is not leucocidia. There's like mature wood and Tronia in it. It's quite diverse. And also a huge section of it is still quite grassy. It had, I think, one major fire came through it, and since then it's been mostly well managed there. And it's quite still very much a grassy system. It's just like a certain section of it is very woody, but not leucocidia woody. Yeah.
Okay. It's interesting. Okay, so I don't know, maybe William, I don't know if this will help with your suggestion question or if it'll drift us away, but maybe I've taken some notes while people have been talking about the main things that have come out for me and using Michelle's idea of a nexus approach. So Michelle, your nexus is there in the middle. Sorry about my handwriting, everyone. And then we can decide if we want to have tea first and finish the discussion, or if we want to finish the discussion and then have tea, whichever psychologically is better. So I've just put here, let me move the, so nexus idea, we've got a challenge with mountain definition because mountains are defined in different ways in different places according to different protocols. Kim's paper she presented really had a very nice way of defining those, very discrete orographic entities. So if we use an orographic approach, I think it's more practical topographically. And there's GMBA has a very detailed protocol for that as well, using change. So that could inform the Mountain Area Catchments Act. If we want to leverage on that act to say we want to define this mountain as something, we would like to ask the minister to please declare for purposes of dealing with alien or native range expanding species. We could also bring in the idea of biosphere reserves in the sense that they don't define mountains, but they certainly have become very popular in the last while as a mechanism for driving a conservation agenda in a landscape that's also utilized by people. So it's not a strict conservation agenda, but it is a lever one can pull on. And obviously mountains overlap with strategic water source areas, so that brings in the water side, and those are well defined as well. So if one can overlap a good topographic definition with a strategic water source area, maybe that could push a little bit of the legislative side along, going back to policy, strategy, and legislation. And what I got from Brian's talk really was we have popcorn legislation on invasives that's evolved over time more as a reactive legislation, but it's not framed in a policy, and his strategy that he and his team put together was never really, hasn't been adopted. So we have kind of bones but no skeleton, so to speak. And then the bush encroachment legislation Grant spoke about is very similar. There's a proposed policy, and there's bits of legislation under CARA, but there's no cohesive legislative framework from policy all the way up to what does it mean for the guy on the ground. And then Sue's mentioned this SA Action as an international convention. And I think with those, as Sue is really our champion, one of our champions in South Africa, on that, William as well, is these international conventions are often put on us rather than us informing them in a way that's practical in our context. So we commit to these ambitious things, but they don't necessarily help the situation on the ground. And I think with Range X, we've certainly been doing a lot of that with our partners, bringing them here, showing them our system, helping them understand it so that they don't just lump our results from the project into a global synthesis that doesn't make sense in our context either. So there's this constant north-south education that has to go on while maintaining our understanding of what needs to happen here. Then linked to this is worldviews on land tenure, and this obviously goes back into the history of South Africa, where we have state land, which includes protected areas. We have traditional authority land, which is officially state land, but it's under customary law. So a back of envelope calculation I did the other day is that 80% of the Maluti-Drakensberg is actually under customary law. It's not under any other form of legislative governance. So that includes Lesotho, which is a traditional authority at a national scale. And then the bulk of the South African Maluti-Drakensberg is actually under some form of customary law, particularly when you take in the Eastern Cape, Transkei, etc. A large part of the foothills of the KZN Drakensberg, Kwakwa, etc. So that's a very, very important land tenure system that has major implications for conservation, because if you don't bring those people in to these discussions and capacitate and enable interventions there, you don't really get large-scale traction. And then that brings the question is who's ultimately responsible? We have different land tenure systems. The law at the moment says if you own property, you are liable. But if we take the Maluti-Drakensberg, that means 80% of the mountain is not owned by anyone other than state. And is the state going to be ultimately liable for not implementing its own legislation? And does it actually have the capacity and the resources to implement its own legislation on its own property? So, and then if you add expropriation without compensation, that increases the amount of state land that the state would have to manage to be compliant with its own law. So the state's probably not in favor of that. So it brings a financial model. Who's going to actually be responsible for financing things like the UNC, DP, XYZ? Thanks. You've practiced that. Who's going to actually what is the financial model for these things? Is it the 5% tax base in South Africa who has to fund their own land clearing as well as everyone else's, including the state, through taxes? Or are there other financial mechanisms that can be leveraged to actually address that problem? And that obviously comes down to capacity, who will do the work physically, and obviously working for water and the other natural resource management programs are a good model for actually bringing in unemployed people and upskilling and training those for that. So if you have a good financial model, you could have a link with private sector, even stimulate private sector. So willing buyer of services could be doing some of these things, but often the cost at the moment of doing these things overrides the benefits that you would actually get from it. So what is the benefit of clearing bush encroachments? Are you going to get a return on your investments in terms of grazing, animal auction value, other kind of benefits? Can you sell the water from your farm because you've cleared bush encroachments and you've increased water runoff? But the National Water Act means all water is national, so you don't actually get a financial benefit for increasing water productivity off your farm.
We actually have a comment on that from Michelle. She says the amendments to the National Water Act speak to the protection of strategic water sources.
Okay, but does it mean that the private landowner would get an incentive for clearing his land and increasing water production?
Examples in the Yugu Takula of business sector funding land restoration.
Okay, so there's a thread to pull there. And then obviously with these things, how do you might have a good financial model, you might have the capacity through an existing model like the natural resource management programs, but can you upscale them in time can you replicate them and upscale them in time to address the problem at the rate that it's escalating? Taking grants farm as an example, and obviously that also links to fire just now. Then you've got methods. So whoever takes ultimate responsibility would need to use methods in terms of best practice. So those best practice methods would need to be defined, including herbicides and making sure that there's a suite of herbicides that are available to be used without getting into trouble. Fire management obviously comes in there as both a method and a risk to be managed. So can one use fire and the Working on Fire program, as well as limiting fire impact from too much biomass, and then biocontrol. Can we push a biocontrol agenda even harder for these, for instance, rosacea species that are problems in mountains? And then topography comes into methods as well, because you've got complex topography, which is often dangerous to work in. And there's obviously liability, etc. if your team, basically there's some very practical elements to think about there. So then the only thing I think I didn't mention was riparian zones obviously speak to strategic water source areas and the legislation as it exists at the moment for alien species. And then research and empirical costings, like William mentioned. What more research do we need to do to actually quantify these things so that we can actually make a case? What do we need to quantify? And then my little suggestion here is, can the Grassland Society of Southern Africa be the vehicle, and Justin's left, because I think he really need a tea. Can the GSSA be the vehicle that takes this discussion forward and sets a precedent for pulling it all together? And then what? Yeah. So that's kind of what synthesis I got out. I don't know if that helps with what you were thinking, William, or if I've drifted even further. So kind of what next? There's so many things that could be worked on simultaneously, and maybe we just need a tea break now, and then we close after that. Let's let's wrap up the afternoon before we have complete brain meltdowns. And we still have 16 brave people online. So I think that's very impressive on a Friday afternoon. 16. So we started with 30, so we've only had a mortality of 50%, so it's not too bad. So well done. Yeah, so I don't know if anyone would like to we just give a 15 minutes for last questions, last comments, and then we'll just close up.
Well, the one thing, I'm not sure how much public interest there is in the mountains and their biota, but I would have thought that the opportunities for getting people excited are enormous. And don't lose sight of, you can turn more people on by showing them pictures of pollinators. Like one of my doctoral students had a sunbird pollination on the tips of its tongues, and that had hundreds of people from all over the world wanting to come to South Africa to see this thing, compared to the usual paper where nobody would be interested at all. We owe, I think, to the South African public and to people around the world a spreading of our knowledge and understanding and the beauty of the mountains and the flowers and the plants that grow within them. So I don't know if you have that as part of your agenda, but I think it ought to be.
Thanks, William. You're quite right. We need to market our mountains over and above the research, or use the research to market them in fancy ways that people can relate to. I agree completely. Any other closing comments, thoughts? Okay.
I'm also curious about indigenous plant use for ethnomedicines and so on. And there's a lot of concentration on what's going on in forests, but I'd be very interested to know what the contributions of grassy areas are. And I'm not sure if that's been documented, how different biomes have contributed different kinds of ethnopharmaceuticals.
Yeah, certainly formally, I don't know, but I do know there's a massive problem of over-harvesting in our area. There's trucks that come in, particularly for helichrysum. And the Bekwena Royal Council, who's one of the two royal houses in Kwakwa, is very concerned that outside people are coming in, to basically they've harvested their stuff in KZN and now they're coming into Kwakwa to harvest stuff from the mountains there. So particularly helichrysum, not sure which species it is, some of those bigger shrubby ones. I don't think they're going all the way up to get trileniatum, but certainly some of the lower altitude splendidum, and so there is a big informal trade in grassland medicinal species, but I don't think it's been quantified, and there's no one studying that in our area. And there's obviously Pelargonium pseudoides in the Eastern Cape has been well studied in terms of harvesting impacts, and it also occurs in the Berg, but I'm not sure if there's actually I don't think anyone's tracking that in real time. I don't know if Sandby does that kind of thing, or should be doing that kind of thing, or you know. But it's definitely very valid. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
Um, I don't know what the point was for the on the riparian forest stuff. But just there's Nancy Job at Sandby is co-leading with some people from the department. She says there's a lot of focus on riparian areas from for whatever reason, there's some initiative to try and collect data from all over, and so there's a lot of work that's just starting up. So I don't know if there's any way that there's data or somebody interested to plug into that group, but it's definitely something that our freshwater team with our veg team is trying to see what's out there, basically, because there's just so little.
Should chat to Grant because he's been doing a lot of work on willow, Salix babylonica particularly. But yeah, our riparian systems have also changed dramatically, but that's another workshop for another day. So yeah. I'll just mention, many people don't know we have an indigenous willow, Salix micronata, and the old historical collectors like William Burchell and Johann Drage and others would record these incredible stands of up to 12 meters high along the Orange River of our indigenous willow with a whole succession of other species away from the waterline that no longer exist. That ecosystem is extinct. It's now all weeping willow, poplar, crack willow, and other temperate invasive species. And we've had functional extinction of that indigenous willow riparian, in the Vaal and the Orange River catchments, probably in the last 150 years. So, and we found a Salix micronata growing outside Clarence on a farm called Scarplights. Peter and I went with some Malagasy colleagues who were visiting, and it's an incredibly beautiful willow. It's totally distinct to the alien willows, and it's got a very Africanized willow shape. It's a bit like a Masasa tree crossed with a Phoria, crossed with something else. And we've lost that environmental memory. And that used to be the willow we had on all our riverbanks, and it's now there's maybe one big one here, one big one there, and the rest are alien. So just another workshop for another time, but yeah. Any last comments? All right, so one of the ideas that's come out, Peter suggested it actually over tea, was we maybe do like a press release from this workshop, focusing on mountains and the risks. Oh, sorry.
There's one comment online, Errol, saying the point about marketing South Africa's mountain is an important one, but it's not clear who is responsible for this. There are far fewer people spending time walking or hiking in the Drakensberg now than there were 20, 30 years ago. I also don't get the sense that people in urban areas are really aware of the importance of grasslands as water catchment areas or for the biodiversity protection.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I guess no one person can be really responsible for that. It's something we all need to do in our various capacities. So
I think it's just worth mentioning on that about the mountain ecotourism, which is, it's incredible how much they all part of our naturalists. So the mountains sell themselves, and we get a huge number of foreign and domestic tourists. And we've tapped into those iNaturalist records from the Maloti Drakensberg. There's thousands and thousands of records of plants, birds, insects. They're quite accurate. So, I mean, we have to do more work about it, but I think mountain ecotourism is a great way to involve citizen science in documenting these patterns. Are really helpful.
I've in Australia. I stayed in a hotel, and they had a mammal week, and you could go out with graduate students who all their mammals are nocturnal. It's a pain. So you go out in the evening and look at the mammals, and they tell you about the mammals. And they also gave talks. So it's a wonderful way of getting graduate students exposed in an informal way, around Cathedral Peak Hotel or the appropriate places. It is some form of outreach. It takes effort, of course.
yeah. No, it's all good. It's really, really great ideas, part of the science engagement, kind of thing. Yeah, any other online comments, Bridget, or we? Okay, all good. All right. So the idea that Pizza suggested is that maybe from this workshop we could do a media press release, basically highlighting that mountains are important in South Africa, that they are under these various threats from native and an alien invasive woody species. The legislation is not coherent, and maybe the hook we could hang everything on is the mountain catchments. What is the term? The mountain? Uh, no, the Mountain Area Catchment Act. That could be the piece of legislation that we hang this on, because it sounds like from what Brian and Grant said earlier that that is existing legislation that is mountain specific, and it enables immediate, well, I say immediate, but there's no complicating legislation in terms of using that to identify areas that need priority action. And then maybe that can kickstart a bit of a herbicide untangling as to what you are and what you're not allowed to do.
Debbie says, amongst others, I suggest using our media sponsors,
Okay, that's a
the
great
mass
idea.
media.
Okay, all right. Is that Atmosphere? Are they still here? Oh, okay. Can we phone her to get her to come back? She's probably already through Tromsburg. So, but yeah, I don't know, Justin. Is that something we are allowed to do from an output like this, from a workshop like this?
Yeah,
There's no GSSA policy that says it has to
no,
go
but
through council or something.
it won't be the GSSA releasing a statement on something. It's, you putting together something that you'll presumably sign, or some people will. So the GSSA is very much a forum for people to discuss stuff. It's not actually like it's not controlling what you say or anything like that. You are an independent speaker, essentially.
We just wanted the GSSA ban on it, so if there's litigation, it goes to council before it comes to.
That did at the World Biodiversity Conference recently was to circulate this draft statement and just say, does are all the delegates happy with that? And so it's like a strong statement to say, I don't know, 50 experts gathered together on mountains and offer a workshop and endorse this. I don't know, just circulate the statement. I think it has more weight coming from a group.
Okay. Okay. We'll debrief and think about doing something like this. Yeah. I'll do it. I'll do it. Oh, I'll get the contact list from Annette. Yeah. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it. I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming. It was a really great in-person crowd. Thank you to the online crowd and the online presenters. It was really great to have you guys join us. Thanks to Grant who co-designed this. We co-designed it together. So he got bored, I think, and he's gone to write a manuscript with Brian. I'm very grateful to him, and then obviously GSSA for allowing us to use the space and present all of this and engage with you guys. And ETH Zurich, who sponsored the whole workshop. So ETH Zurich bought out the whole workshop as part of the RangeX project for us to use this. I think it's the first time, Justin, that people have been able to register online for this workshop without paying because of the sponsorship. Yeah, so we've added a bit of innovation to GSSA there in terms of making it open access, basically. Thanks for allowing some flexibility for that. So, yeah, and then I think I've thanked everyone. Thanked the plenaries. Thanks, Conrad. It's very enjoyable. So thanks for that. I suggest you give a bit of applause. Yeah.